Welcome to Lesson 15 in our study of the book of Revelation as a part of the prophecy series. Today we're going to be continuing on looking at the seal judgments, the final seal, and we're going to be focusing in on chapter 8. And if you remember, 2 lessons ago we looked at the opening of the first 6 seals. But then when we got to chapter 7, there was a pause where we looked at 2 different groups of people in the midst of the tribulation. So we saw the Jews who were sealed, as well as the tribulational martyrs. So today, we're going to continue on with that 7th seal. So we're going to be looking at Revelation chapter 8, verses 1 through 12, the 7th seal, and the 7 trumpets. The 7th seal and the 7 trumpets. Now, we're going to see several things here that are going to be quite amazing that kind of tell you some things about what's going to be happening in the future. So let's first of all, when we begin our study today, we're going to look in the first part, which is Revelation chapter 8, verse 1, the opening of the 7th seal. So we're going to take a look at this final seal that's open. So I want you to notice with me what the text says in verse 1. When the Lamb opened the 7th seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. So it's very interesting. When this happens, we're going to see several things here. The seal is opened, but here's what I want you to notice. When the 7th seal is opened, there was silence in heaven for 30 minutes. So basically, remember, we're at the scene of the throne of God, where you have the 4 living creatures, where you have the 24 elders and a multitude of angels, and they're all praising God and giving Him glory, continually praising Him. Well, when the 7th seal is opened, the text tells us that there is silence in heaven for 30 minutes. Now, you might be wondering, why is there silence? Well, the 7th seal contains the 7 trumpets. So what we're going to see now is that the 7th seal reveals 7 more judgments. The 7th seal is a judgment, and the judgment is another 7 judgments. And they're called the trumpet judgments. So that brings us now to the second part of what we're looking at here, the 7 angels and the 7 trumpets, which we find in chapter 8, verse 2. So let's take a look at the text and notice what it says. Here's what John records. Then I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and 7 trumpets were given to them. So what's going on here, George? Well, John sees 7 angels who were given 7 trumpets. Now, just like with the seal judgments, those were the seals on the scroll. With each seal that is broken, you see there was a judgment. Now, with the 7th seal, we see that judgment is this revelation of these 7 trumpets that are given to these 7 angels. Now, just to continue on with what's happening around this time, I want you to notice with me chapter 8, verses 3 through 5, the golden censer. Now, if you understand what a censer is like a bowl, okay? It's like a metal bowl, but here it's a gold bowl. So I want you to notice what verse 3 says. Another angel came and stood at the altar with a golden censer, and he was given much incense to offer with the prayers of all the saints on the golden altar before the throne. And the smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints rose before God from the hand of the angel. Then the angel took the censer and filled it with fire from the altar and threw it on the earth. And there were peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. All right, so let's take a look. We're going to look at this golden censer in verses 3 through 5. I'm going to break it up into several sections here. So first of all, I want you to notice in the first part of verse 3, the angel with the censer. So what we're going to see here is okay, we've seen 7 angels that are given 7 trumpets. Now John sees another angel who stands before the altar with a golden censer, or shall I say a bowl, okay, a golden bowl. Now, what is this angel doing? Well, that's going to bring us now to chapter 3, the second part, which we see the offering of the prayers. The offering of the prayers. Now, what do you mean, George? Well, the angel was given incense to offer with the prayers of the saints. So, the censer would be some way to offer incense, but it would be also a way to offer the prayers of the saints before the altar. Now, this is pretty significant. I want you to follow along with this because when we talk about the prayers of the saints, I want you to think about who that is, okay? So notice with me now, when we get to verse 4, the offering before God. So here's what I want you to notice. The angel offers the incense and prayers before God. The angel offers incense and the prayers of the saints before God. Now, that brings up a significant point that you and I need to consider. Because here's the thing. As believers, we are constantly praying. Constantly. And you say, well, I don't pray 24/7, George. No. But if you think about all the prayers of all believers for the last 2,000 years, the prayers of the saints, those, according to this passage, are being offered up to God as an offering, a sweet-smelling offering with the incense on the altar before the Lord. That's what this passage is talking about, as our prayers come before Him. And sometimes you and I wonder if He listens. Isn't that interesting? But our prayers are offered before Him like an offering. So that brings us now to verse 5, where we see the censer is thrown to the earth. So here's what I want you to notice. The angel throws the censer filled with fire to the earth. Now, where's this fire coming from? Well, the text tells you this fire from the altar. And he fills the censer and then he throws it onto the earth. Now, what of course happens then, of course, is there's rumblings and thunders, and it affects in many ways the things that are happening on the earth at the time, which we see are what? Flashes of lightning and an earthquake. So again, it has an effect on the earth. Now, that's going to bring us to Revelation chapter 8, verses 6 through 7, where we're going to start looking at the trumpets. Now remember, with the seals we looked and there were 7 seal judgments. Now we're going to look at this additional 7 judgments, which was part of the 7th seal, and we're going to start with the first trumpet. So here's what I want you to notice. Look with me at what verse 6 says. Now, the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets prepared to blow them. The first angel blew his trumpet, and there followed hail and fire mixed with blood. And these were thrown upon the earth, and a third of the earth was burned up, and a third of the trees were burned up, and all green grass was burned up. Now, let's take a look. Let's take it in a couple of verses here. Let's start with verse 6. The angels prepare themselves. So what we're going to see here is they're getting themselves ready. They're getting ready to execute the judgments that have been given to them. So here's what I want you to notice. The 7 angels prepare to blow their trumpets. They're ready to blow their trumpets. Well, okay, so that brings us to verse 7, where we see the first trumpet sounded. So here is the blast of the first trumpet and what happens as a result of it. First of all, I want you to notice when we look at this in verse 7, the trumpet's effect. So here's what I want you to notice. Here's what happens when that first trumpet is sounded. With the first trumpet, hail and fire fell upon the earth. Now, I think all of us understand hail. We occasionally have times where we notice, especially during the summer, that hail falls from the sky, and it is typically ice, like chunks of ice, rather very small or golf ball size, and that is something we understand. Now, none of us have ever seen hail fall that is cold with fire upon the earth. But this is what's happening with this first trumpet judgment. Now, of course, that's going to bring us to the second part we need to see here in verse 7, which is the result. Of course, when you have that kind of thing happening, where you have hail and fire falling on the earth, obviously there's going to be some sort of result or damage that takes place. So the hail and fire destroy a third of all plant life on the earth. Okay, I want you to think about that. If you divide the entire world, the globe, in 3 sections, then a third of that is destroyed. A third of all plant life on the earth is destroyed by this first judgment, this first trumpet. Amazing. Well, it doesn't end there. Now we come to chapter 8, verses 8 through 9, and we see the second trumpet. There's another judgment that is coming. So I want you to notice what it says in verse 8. The second angel blew his trumpet, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea, and a third of the sea became blood. A third of living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. All right, so let's take again. Here we are. We got the second trumpet. Let's start off in the first part of verse 8, and we're going to see the trumpet's effect. So here's what happens when this trumpet is sounded. A flaming mountain is thrown into the sea. Now, before we move on, I need to say to you, this is where what we believe it might be is simply our thought process. For instance, like my thought process doesn't necessarily mean that's what it will ultimately be. But here is something that could possibly fit with it. So the burning mountain, what exactly are we talking about there? Well, some scholars believe that the description of the burning mountain fits with a comet or a meteor. The impact of this would disrupt sea life, causing all living creatures to die. In fact, the text says a third. It would also cause a tidal wave that would destroy ships upon the sea. So it's obviously some sort of flaming mountain. Now, could it be a comet or a meteor? Maybe. Could it be something else that we don't know about? Very possible. The point is that it's telling you that this second trumpet, again, is wreaking havoc on the world. And if you think about that, with the loss of sea life, there is not a nation in this world that does not rely upon seafood or the harvest that comes from the sea. And then to have it turn to blood, that is interesting as well. In fact, notice with me now the result. We're going to see that in the second part of verse 8 through verse 9. Now, what do you mean the result? Well, verse 8, the second part, tells us the condition of the sea. What exactly happens to the sea? Well, a third of the sea was turned to blood. That means it was turned red. It was turned to blood. Now, this parallels God's judgment on Egypt. If you remember, that was one of the main judgments that happened upon Egypt, was that God turned the river Nile to blood. And the cross-reference for that, if you want to go and look at that yourself, would be Exodus chapter 7, verses 14 through 25. So just want you to be aware, this is very similar to something that God has done in the past. Only he's not talking about a river. He's talking about the possibility of the oceans, a third of them being turned to blood. Now, of course, verse 9 is going to talk about the destruction. What exactly does this have as far as the destruction that takes place from this judgment? Well, a third of all marine life and ships are destroyed. So again, a third of all marine life in the sea is destroyed, and a third of all ships. That is a devastating blow to the world. That can't just be overcome with a few years. Now, that brings us then to Revelation chapter 8, verse 10 through 11, where we see the third trumpet. There is a third sounding that takes place. So another judgment is coming. So I want you to notice with me what verse 10 says. The third angel blew his trumpet, and a great star fell from the earth, blazing like a torch. And it fell on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood. A third of the waters became wormwood, and many people died from the water because it had been made bitter. Okay, so let's take a look at this. Is again, the flaming mountain. We can kind of guess maybe that's a comet or a meteor. This is going to be a little bit more difficult, especially when you think about the effect that it has. So let's talk about the trumpet's effect in verse 10. So what I want you to notice is this: a great star falls on a third of the rivers and springs. Now, I don't know how a meteor can do that. So this is something beyond just a simple explanation. But the text is telling you that with this judgment, something falls out of the sky and it affects a third of the rivers and the springs. Now, again, some scholars believe it fits with a description of a comet or a meteor. Maybe a meteor shower or many comets or meteor, I don't know. It affects a third of the rivers. Now, here's what I want you to see when we talk about that in verse 11 is the result. What is the result of this? Well, notice with me when we talk about the result, the text tells us the star's name. So we're going to see the name of this star. It's interesting, the star has a name. So the star is called Wormwood. Very interesting name. Not something that we're used to hearing. Now, what exactly is wormwood? Well, when we think about the scripture, wormwood is a bitter desert plant mentioned only once in the New Testament. So this is the only time that it's mentioned in the New Testament. It is mentioned 7 times in the Old Testament, where it represents sorrow and bitter judgment. So whenever it's mentioned, it's not mentioned in a positive light. It's mentioned in a negative light. And that's exactly what's happening here. This star is called wormwood. Now, it has an effect. What kind of an effect? Notice now the star's effect on water, on the water of a third of the world. What do you mean? The water is contaminated, resulting in the death of many people. So the water is contaminated because of this. Now, if you think for a moment, the only thing I could think of that would be even close that might affect things like that is maybe a nuclear bomb or missile or something that's referred to as falling out of the sky. And radiation would affect water and so forth. I really can't understand this passage to explain it to you, but we just need to take the text and understand this is the judgment that's going to take place in the tribulation. Well, then, that brings us to chapter 8, verse 12, the fourth trumpet. So we're going to basically end with this trumpet. And so we've seen the first 3 trumpets. Now we're going to get into the fourth trumpet. What exactly is happening here? So I want you to notice with me verse 12. The fourth angel blew his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, and a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of their light might be darkened, and a third of the day might be kept from shining, and likewise a third of the night. All right, this is kind of, again, unusual. Just like with the last trumpet, we don't know exactly what that might be. Here is a judgment that takes place on the lights that we have, that is during the day, during the night. And let's take a look at what's happening here. So the fourth trumpet results in a third of the lights of the sky being darkened. So something is happening where the lights that human beings exist with on day and night, whether it's from the moon or from the stars or whether it's from the sun. That is going to be affected in the future. And that brings us to the end of looking at these 4 trumpets that are a part of the 7th seal. That brings us to the end of lesson 15.